Thanks. Well, I think we can get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this online policy dialogue organised with the kind support of the United States Mission to the European Union. This is part of our Transatlantic Challenges series, and I'd like to say thank you to everyone for agreeing to join us on a Friday afternoon. We're going to be talking about the lessons that can be learned from the COVID-19 crisis in the field of fighting disinformation. Now, I think it's fair to say that this pandemic has changed everything in all kinds of parts of our lives. It's changed the way we live our day-to-day lives, it's changed the way we work, it's changed the way we interact with each other, and increasingly it's also changing our relationship with information and the way that we consume news. Now, we've all been trying to keep up to date with the latest lockdown restrictions, symptoms and possible treatments for the virus, what to do if you think that you or someone you know might be infected, and of course, where this whole pandemic has come from and where the virus originated. And with most of us confined to our homes, many of us are finding that we're spending more and more time than ever scrolling through news feeds and reading articles. For example, YouTube recently announced that it has experienced a 75% increase in news viewership on its platform compared to before the crisis. So things have changed in all kinds of ways. Things have also changed with the way that the social media platforms have been taking steps to do things that would be almost unthinkable shortly before the crisis. Yes. For example, removing misinforming content, promoting fact checkers, and working with governments and health authorities to boost the reach of official information. And for users too, such as ourselves. We've learned to have to deal with a rather different information environment, one where there is misleading information on all kinds of subjects, particularly regarding how the virus spreads and its symptoms, its treatment, and much more. And now, even though the lockdowns are beginning to ease, we know that that doesn't mean that things are going to return to normal. So the question that we're looking at now is, has the experience of this crisis fundamentally changed the relationship between government and media, including social media? Has it changed our approach to disinformation? Have the tactics used by disinformation actors changed? Have the tactics used to effectively counteract them? Have they developed over the last few months? And what lessons can we take from this whole experience to shape the future of this anti-disinformation struggle, including the lessons for governmental regulation and even for our day-to-day habits as web users? Now, to discuss this rich and at times complicated subject, I'm delighted to be joined today by a diverse panel of experts. First of all, European Commission Vice President for Values and Transparency, Vera Jourova. Thank you very much for agreeing to join us today.
Thank you, hello.
And I will ask you to speak in a few moments about the new European Commission communication on exactly this subject, which came out earlier this week. We are also joined by Jamie Fly, the President of Radio Free Europe / Radio Liberty, joining us today from Prague. And Marie Bonnet, Project Manager at First Draft News, which is an organization which is the force behind Crosscheck and other fact-checking platforms, and has recently established an online course for journalists on how to cover coronavirus in this time of unprecedented misleading information. Thank you very much to all of you for being with us today. Now, before we get started, just a word regarding the structure of the event. We'll hear from our speakers first, and there will then be an opportunity for a couple of rounds of questions from the audience at the end. We're all probably getting quite used to using platforms such as Zoom by now, but just to go over it again, you will have two methods for asking questions. You can raise your hand digitally by clicking the raise hand button, which you will find underneath the participants list at the bottom of your screen. And there is also a button for a Q&A where you can type in your questions manually. And we will come back to them at the end. So I will take both of these formats, whichever you feel more comfortable with, in the last 15 or 20 minutes when we have time for questions. But without further ado, Vice President, just a couple of days ago, as I mentioned, the Commission published its new communication on tackling COVID-19 disinformation. Could you kick us off by telling us a little bit more about this document? In particular, you met with some representatives from social media platforms and other stakeholders towards the start of this crisis. Could you maybe say what was the outcome of this meeting and how did it shape the drafting of the communication? And is the communication setting the stage for a reform of the EU's existing anti-disinformation methods, or is it more a story of continuity with the previous action plan? Please, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. Hello again. Happy to be here. Thank you for the question. Well, yes, we already have some history together. I had a very intensive dialogue with the platforms and big tech players before GDPR was adopted. It was quite a big topic to explain why we want the individual people to be protected as for their privacy. Then hate speech online, we had a code of conduct agreed on, and also the code of practice on disinformation. So now in COVID context, we didn't start from the scratch. So it was a continuation to reply on your question. But now we sat around the table understanding that the issue of disinformation has a new sense of urgency. And you described it very well. People sitting in the lockdown, the avalanches of information, health and life at stake. This is the combination of the factors which caused that we looked at disinformation with new fresh eyes, and we agreed on a mechanism with the platforms, which was, if I am to simplify it, in fact, the principle that the online platforms will promote the links to the authorities which have the reliable information for the citizens. So WHO and health authorities. Don't ask me about the situations when they have contradicting each other, but we had some authorities which had decisive role in managing the COVID crisis. So of course we were referring to these authorities which dealt with the health issue. And we also wanted to remove ads that offered fake medicine or inflate prices for normal products, dangerous advice such as drinking bleach and do not wash hands. It doesn't have any meaningful impact. But this kind of advice also undermined the trust to authorities and to institutions. So it was a combination of many bad factors. And so that's why we wanted to, at the platforms, to give priority to the reliable content and remove or somehow diminish the appearance of the disinformation. And it is a voluntary agreement, and still is after the adoption of the communication this Wednesday. It's not a regulation. It is still continuation of agreement with the platforms. We have the biggest players on board. We are now discussing with TikTok and with WhatsApp to join. And we ask them to be more transparent and more accountable, and to inform the public about what's happening in their system, because it should not behave as a black box. And the people should start understanding that not everything they read on Facebook or Google is trustworthy information, and that so we want them to report on a monthly basis about the appearance of disinformation, the possible origins of such disinformation, the technique, manipulative technique which is used, the targets, the content of the disinformation, and also the fact-checking, whether it happened or not, or whether there was some fact-checking which is important element of our plan also. And we want the people to have access to these reports in all EU member states' languages. It cannot be a privilege only for those who are, the happy people who speak English or French. So we wanted these reports to be practical announcements for the general public, not only for the Commission. And so these are the core things. On fact-checking, I want to emphasize that because in the middle of working on this communication, there was that conflict between the President Trump and Twitter. And I use this as an illustration of what we would like to do in Europe, that even if it is a speech of a politician, of somebody having power and having privileged access to millions of people, the politician has to count with the possibility that he will be fact-checked, that his speech will be fact-checked. And I wanted to shift a little bit from the possibility to probability. Yeah, because we see that there is such an enormous power in it that the politician or whoever who wants to influence the society can use these platforms to spread the information, that there should be some immunity of the system, at least in provision of the facts and reliable and evidence-based information. For me, this is not censoring. This is just offering the multiple choice. This is free speech, which is added or complemented by another free speech. So this is the pre-taste of what we present also in our communication this Wednesday, and this principle of multiple choices and the competition of opinions, which you will see in our European Democracy Action Plan at the end of the year. This is the strategy and action plan we are now working on. Sorry I was long. I will be shorter next time.
No problem at all. You've covered some very important topics there, and I think it's crucial to remember that, as you say, the stakes are very high here. Lives are at stake, especially when it comes to misinformation or disinformation about healthcare and potential treatments for the virus that could actually be counterproductive. But I would like to touch in a little bit more detail on the idea of authoritative sources that you mentioned, or trustworthy, reliable information. Now, this seems like a bit of a change for the approach from some of the social media platforms that previously were not so willing to, if you like, rank one source of information over another. But it seems that when it comes to healthcare information, that's fairly easily done. There is mostly agreement on who the authoritative sources are. You can promote material from the WHO, for example. You can promote the government's regulations about lockdowns. But when it comes to political content, that's rather more controversial. So is this something that we are likely to see as a change, like a watershed moment, that from now on the European Commission or the EU and its member state governments will be asking the social media platforms to take more responsibility to promote a particular source of information over another, even when it comes to political content? Or is this only something which is likely to be the case for healthcare related subjects, like for the immediate healthcare crisis?
We all feel that this is a serious issue, and we cannot compare the political speech and the political opinions with the situation when the health is at stake and where the expert opinion is needed, and where it is possible to update according to the lege artis knowledge and new intelligence. We will work on both whenever the sector is at stake, and it's not only health. Now we are facing the new era or new battle, which will be around vaccination. Yeah, so already now We are desperately looking for vaccination and vaccine against COVID, and we are funding the programs and hoping that vaccine will help us to get rid of corona. It is such a clear story. And still, at this situation, there is an increased appearance of disinformation against vaccination. We have quite precise figures. But it's not only health, it can be the wave of disinformation with having security aspects, having the topic of climate change, migration, minorities, you know, especially now when we see the new wave of excitement in the society relating to racism. These are all the topics which will require the sectors and the responsible people to take care of their truth, to take care of their data and facts and provide it to the public. We will have to be much more proactive. It's not for the platforms to do that. Yes. But when it comes to political speech, and we speak especially about the volatile weeks and months before the elections, we will have to discuss very thoroughly in European Union with the stakeholders, with the experts, researchers, politicians, with you, how to approach this, because I want to fight against disinformation. I don't want the politicians whose program is only lying and manipulating people to win the elections. That's quite clear. But at the same time, the plan is not to decrease the freedom of speech and the free political debate. Yeah. So we need more time to work on this. We have some lessons from the past. We have the American political presidential elections. We had the Brexit referendum. We had several elections in the EU where we know that there was effect of disinformation and there was effect of the algorithms which work against the free speech and broad public debate. I myself do not like this privatization of public debate and this organization into the bubbles, because this is not what we want. We want horizontal debate. So at this moment, I can tell you, in our plan is not to decrease the freedom of speech, to promote the right for information, to promote the competition of free speech, and to come with some maybe special rules for political campaigning before the elections. And this is also about disinformation, because what we see in our member states, that there is over-regulation regarding offline political advertising, but for online, more or less, not much. So these are just the directions of our thoughts, and we will have to work very intensively on it during the next several months to have the good product at the end of the year, which is the European Democracy Action Plan.
Okay, so we're looking forward to seeing what emerges from the Democracy Action Plan.
You have to contribute to it. It's not.
Of course.
I invite you.
And I believe the other half of the other side of the coin is the Digital Services Act.
Exactly. Yes.
And there's a consultation ongoing about that, which we can and will, of course, contribute to.
Indeed, you are very well informed, and thank you for this chance to clarify how to understand these two parallel tracks. The Digital Services Act seeks to increase, will probably increase the transparency and responsibility of the platforms operating on European single market. And we will seriously consider the responsibility of the platforms when it comes to illegal content, which is terrorism, extremism, hate speech, and child pornography.
And not necessarily the same thing as disinformation. Correct?
Well, my mantra has always been, what is illegal offline must be illegal online. And it is illegal online, but nobody takes care of it properly. Yeah, so we need to come with the mechanism with increased proactivity for the platforms to detect and to announce such content. And then the law enforcement part has to be done, but necessarily not for disinformation, where we have to be much more careful, because the thin line between how to say harmful disinformation, which is not illegal, and the free speech. I always say that the facts belong to everybody. This is common, but the opinions must be our own privilege to say everywhere and every time. Yeah. So you see, this is much more sophisticated problem, much more subtle. Too much is at stake here, and it's the freedom of speech and right of information. So my work on disinformation will go hand in hand with the Digital Services Act, and we will, at the end of the day, come with a balanced approach, European philosophy, European future, European vision for how the digital world should look like. Because the people have shifted to digital sphere, but they didn't take their rights with them. And now we should do something to
there's some catching up to be done. Right?
Yes.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for this overview, Vice President. I'm sure we'll come back to a couple of those points in the Q&A. You mentioned the security aspects, and you also mentioned some of the big milestone elections in the last few years that have really raised our awareness of disinformation as a problem, such as the US presidential election or the Brexit election. Now, back then, we were hearing an awful lot about foreign state actors interfering in democracy. And particularly back then, it was Russian bots or Russian state-controlled, state-sanctioned influence operations targeting Western democracy. And maybe this is a good time to bring in Jamie from Radio Free Europe. Jamie, over the last few months, it's not just been the Russian state actions that we've been hearing about, but there is another state that's online tactics has been brought under the spotlight, namely China. Now, is this a result of China kind of trying to save its reputation as being the country where the virus originated, and so having a kind of interest in spreading a conflicting message in the West? Or does it have a broader goal? And in your experience, has the Chinese approach to using online tactics for spreading disinformation in the West, is it comparable to what's been happening from Russia, or do they have their own aims and their own goals and their own methods?
Thanks, Paul. I think the quick answer is it's too early to tell. I think the troubling thing that we've learned over the last several months during the pandemic is that we've had at least part of the answer given to us. There was a raging debate in think tanks and academic circles about this question in the last several years, and there was a skepticism among some that the Chinese would adopt the so-called Russian playbook, the sort of brutal scorched earth tactics online, propagating disinformation that went well beyond just spreading their strategic message. And my fear, given what we've seen here and there over the last several months, is that the Chinese have decided to adopt the Russian playbook. The Russians have become very effective over decades prior to a lot of these technological trends of propagating a certain type of disinformation that is really divisive, is aimed at sowing chaos and confusing. And we have seen several instances now tied to coronavirus where the Chinese have taken a similar approach. I think here in Europe, including where I sit in the Czech Republic, was kind of ground zero of some of these efforts. And it was tied to the early weeks in March and April at a moment when the Chinese were trying to send the message to the world that they had recovered from the pandemic, that they were now in a position of being a global leader, assisting other countries with their own pandemic struggles. and they started doing humanitarian assistance, medical assistance, selling equipment, but portraying it as humanitarian assistance. And they didn't just highlight the fact that they were providing this assistance, but they mixed their messaging with messages that were also either anti-EU, aimed at driving a wedge between some EU member states. They obviously pushed conspiracy theories about the origins of the virus. Interestingly, we sometimes saw Russian and Chinese and even Iranian narratives overlap, where the same conspiracy theory would be almost laundered by one of those states, picked up and used by another. And I think both the European Commission as well as the US Department of State have highlighted this in some of their recent reports. So that's the concerning thing. The other thing I just add is even post-pandemic in China, given the increased focus on issues like Hong Kong, on Xinjiang, given the turmoil just in the last several weeks in the United States, I think we've seen Chinese information efforts really try to pick up on both advancing their own narratives about issues, but also inserting themselves into domestic political debates, which again is a new trend. That was not something China was doing, at least openly, several years ago. And you've seen a mix of accounts online that are not easily tied back to a particular Chinese state institution. And then you've seen Chinese diplomats even use their official diplomatic social media accounts to push some of these messages. And again, that's something that we've seen for years from a number of Russian embassies overseas, using their social media accounts. Obviously in the Chinese case, I think it's some people referring to it as sort of wolf warrior diplomacy. And again, it seems modeled on some of the Russian tactics. I guess I'll just end by saying the big question for me is whether this is the new normal, whether it was just because of the sensitivity of the moment that the Chinese felt emboldened to adopt these sorts of tactics. And I guess we're going to have to see whether they build the institutional structures to continue to engage online in not just in the United States or Europe, but a number of other countries to try to insert themselves into their political debates. And I don't think we have enough evidence yet to know exactly what the Chinese approach is going to be and how long lasting it will be, or whether it'll be something that will just be exercised at moments of crisis.
Now, as you mentioned, some of these some of the narratives and some of the methods that are being used by other actors are directed specifically against Europe, and some of them specifically against the US, but there is also a kind of general anti-Western trend, I suppose. And since we are trying to consider a transatlantic dimension here as well, would you say there are things that the EU and the US could learn from one another when it comes to fighting against disinformation? I mean, so far we seem to be seeing that Europe is in some ways a bit of a standard setter for regulation regarding data protection, but also the idea of regulating social media platforms. But it is still the case that a lot of the technological innovation is really coming from the US. So can this be combined into a kind of combined response in more ways?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential, and there's been potential for the last several years as this conversation has evolved. As you note, we face similar challenges. Both the United States and Europe are being targeted by several of the leading malign actors online. Unfortunately, some of the messaging, and this has again been something the Russians have perfected, has often been aimed at driving a wedge between the transatlantic partners. In my previous life, I did some research looking at Russian messaging to the US public. It was often anti-European, specifically aimed at pulling Americas away from Europe. And there's plenty of research that's shown the opposite in Europe of anti-American messaging. And again, we've seen subtle hints of the Chinese adopting this. So we're both getting bombarded by this challenge, and so there should be a need for common cause. As you noted, I think the the differences have been that the European debate about the platforms and about regulation is much more advanced than it has been in the US. We've seen pockets of discussion in the US political system about a tougher stance vis-a-vis the platforms, which I personally think is probably the way to go. But I think we're going to have to let the presidential election play out in the US and get beyond this political atmosphere right now for any real serious reforms. The one area where I do think that maybe the EU could learn a little bit more from the US, and it's partly because of where I sit right now here at Radio for Europe, Radio Liberty, is the United States, and in our case, the US Congress, has continued to spend significant US taxpayer dollars funding independent media. I mean, that is what RFERL does in 27 countries across, or 27 languages across Eurasia. And that is a huge part of the solution. And so that the way to make societies more resilient to disinformation is to ensure, as the Vice President referred to, that there's competition of free speech, that there are credible alternatives for the audience to turn to when they're being bombarded with conspiracy theories or disinformation. And a number of European countries fund public service media, but that you don't have the same coordinated approach across the EU in support of independent media. I think European governments are often very vocal, certainly when our journalists get threatened or other independent media outlets come under pressure. But I think that is one area where the European Union could really lend its heft and experience on these issues to a comprehensive effort to bolster independent media and make sure that we have resilient information spaces that are not as susceptible to being saturated by disinformation. And that's something that I think is going to be even more of a challenge after the pandemic. Independent media was under market pressure because of loss of advertising revenue and the technological changes even before the pandemic. That's been accelerated now with many newsrooms, not just in the countries we operate, but including in Europe and the US, laying off journalists. So those economic pressures are going to lead to consolidation, more political control over media, and all of those things create an environment where it's much easier for malign actors like Russia, China, and Iran to spread disinformation without any real response and without any credible alternative for the audience.
Well, talking of independent media, maybe this is the right moment to turn to Marie, because what First Draft News is involved in is precisely helping out journalists in navigating the disinformation landscape and reporting accurately at a time when it can be more and more challenging to do so. And of course, we've talked about the social media platforms, we've talked about foreign state actors, but this is also something, the experience of the crisis is also something which has really had a major impact on the way that journalists go about their work, and journalists are already kind of put under pressure by having to fact check and keep on top of so much material, but maybe also news consumers as well, as there is higher demand for news than at in previous cases before the crisis. So, Marie, what advice do you have for journalists who are trying to cope with the crisis? And has the whole experience taught us anything that can serve as lessons for the future in how to support a strong, independent media sector that can hopefully try to keep some of that plurality of message that Jamie was talking about?
Thank you, Paul. First of all, I just want to say that the name of the organization is First Draft and not First Draft News, even if that's in the email. And also that we are looking at information disorder in a broader way and not only fact checking, because that also allows us to go and look at the sources and the narratives, or maybe the coordinated narratives that are coming on in the information disorder frame in general. So, yeah, the World Health Organization has been starting to talk about the infodemic since the beginning of the year, expressing the fact that the news and the avalanche of news, as Vera was saying before, is even sometimes more dangerous than the virus itself. As it has been said several times, mis and disinformation can kill. We have seen lots of examples of that. For example, there has been a misinformation going on about the fact that alcohol could cure coronavirus, or at least prevent it. And we have seen that, for example, in Iran, more than 40 people have died before because they have been drinking adulterated alcohol. So this is a moment where misinformation has a direct impact on life. Infodemic around coronavirus also has been huge because of the reliable information being rare and constantly evolving. Even reliable sources, again, as the Vice President of the Commission was saying before, have been adapting to these constant changes, and thus sometimes appearing to be contradicting themselves. The four main trends of misinformation we have seen around coronavirus globally in our monitoring are linked to what we call data or information voids, which are around the origin of the virus itself, the way it spreads, the symptoms and treatments, but also our own behavior as citizens, the behavior of other citizens around us, and the responses from the country's authorities. Journalists can actually use tools like, for example, Google Trends to identify these data voids by identifying what users, what news consumers are actually looking for in the news, to be able to reach out to their audiences more accurately and provide them with useful, simple, and reliable information. And that's something we have been focusing on during this crisis. Fact-checking, for example, is good, but if you fact-check something just by labeling it fake or false without providing any additional context, then you leave this informational void, or this data void, which gets easily filled by any other type of misinformation. So that's also something that we have been discussing with journalists during the pandemic. Studies and articles have shown that, and I can share the links if you want, that in a lot of countries, people have been consuming news from professional media more than usual in the beginning of the crisis. But then, for example, in the UK, we had some studies showing that the infodemic has then led progressively to news avoidance because of the infodemic, because there were too many information that were not maybe making the difference clearly enough between speculation and real information, for example, about the virus and the way it was evolving. So it's also journalists and media's responsibility to be more careful around headlines, around images, around data visualizations that they are using. So at First Draft, as you said in the introduction, we produced an online course for journalists covering coronavirus. It's now available in 7 different languages since a couple of days. So I'm happy to share the link at the end if that's of use. But also webinars and a database of international fact checks around the coronavirus. We help journalists to identify how they can make a difference in their everyday coverage by avoiding to spread additional fear and panic, as well as stereotypes. At the beginning of the crisis, for example, in Europe and the US, we have seen way too many random images showing Asian people wearing masks to illustrate any kind of articles about the spread of the virus in Europe and in the US. And this has led to an increase in racism and stereotypes against the Asian population in the Western countries. So I think it also showed us that we really have to be careful, and this is part of the lessons learned from the crisis.
Yeah, I think this is, you raised a very interesting point about news avoidance. So for, I suppose some people are feeling that there is so much information going out there and so much news to try and keep on top of that it's just stressful, and these are stressful times anyway. And instead of trying to keep on top of things, they turn away from viewing the news at all. And I think that this is something that we have also recognized as a deliberate tactic for disinformation actors, right? To put so much stuff out there that you no longer know what is true Now, I think that it's probably the case that most social media users recently have at least come across the idea that not everything that they read about the virus is necessarily accurate. But would you say that in general, this crisis has raised people's awareness of what disinformation is and how to spot it and what we can do about it? Or is it the case that the disinformation narratives out there are kind of keeping pace with the public awareness of what sort of tactics are being used?
So there are two aspects to this, but first of all, polls and articles, for example, in France and in the US, show that around like 25 or 30% of the people believe in conspiracy theories around coronavirus, such as, for example, the idea that the virus might have been created intentionally in the lab. So that's a lot of people. But I found another poll from Radio France and Le Figaro, which was done in France, last year, which also showed that 45% of the users, of social web users, actually recognize that they have already been sharing misinformation. And strangely enough, I mean, even if 45% again is an awful lot, I think it might be a good sign, because it shows that people are probably more aware than before, that sometimes they're sharing misinformation and that they're able to identify it better. And if when they share it, it's probably in a heated moment, because most of the misinformation and disinformation are actually appealing to our emotions. And when we realize that they are fitting our worldview, we just share it without thinking any longer. And that's something we all do. So that means that it's becoming better because people are getting more aware, but at the same time, that makes also the responsibility grow on people's side to make sure that they avoid sharing whatever comes their way. Then about the tactics, we noticed that there is an evolution in the tactic. I don't know if this evolution is specifically linked to coronavirus. I would say, as Vera Jourova said before, that this has been an ongoing process that started before the virus. I think, for example, one of them is what our director, Claire Wardle, is calling weaponization of context. So it's the way some old content is rebranded online with new false captions or allegations, or transformed to change the message. So we have seen an example of that in Mexico, for example, where there was one line of an interview of the president of Mexico, who is usually very criticized for his authoritarian ways and his difficult relationship with the media. And this line was saying, "We control public opinion because we control the main newspaper in the country." And he was actually saying that in a video. And the strap at the top of the video, when it was shared, said, "This is the scene that the journalist who made the video deleted from his interview with the president." And it was shared saying that this is the proof, the final proof, that the president is actually manipulating the media. But actually, the president was talking about a historical example in that specific interview. And he explains that when you look at the whole interview, but the extract itself and how it is shared with the caption around it is really diffuse and meaning to shock and to trigger emotional content. We also see that there are a lot of hate speech. What we see, which is not, I would say, disinformation as such, but it's part of information disorder and what disinformation agents are contributing to. So there is a lot of hate speech around coronavirus to blame certain parts of the population, either for the outbreak or for the spread of the virus. So it often takes the forms of memes. So these images that are often meant to be funny, but images with text on it, which are generally more difficult to monitor, also because it's not proper text. So for example, there is one doctored photo that has been shared all around the world showing a picture of Yoko Ono and John Lennon, and John Lennon being close to her, but with a mask. And again, that fuels some anti-Asian sentiments all over the world, and it has been really shared in lots of different countries. And we also see a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment shared by images like this, for example, in India and in other countries as well. And then last but not least, there is also realization by the agents of disinformation that the mainstream platforms are actually taking action against misinformation. And so we have seen empirically, again, I don't think there is a study on that for now, but we have seen that some disinformation agents are moving to messaging apps and niche platforms such as WhatsApp, for example, or Telegram, which are more difficult to monitor for us, for example, than Facebook or Twitter.
Thanks very much, Marie. And just to round things off before we go to the audience for questions, not all of the information that is being spread or the disinformation that is being spread online is really done so with intent to mislead, right? Sometimes it is people who are sharing information in good faith. And I think something that a lot of us have probably experienced is friends or family sharing health advice that is clearly a bit dodgy, or some kind of conspiracy theory or something like this. Do you have any advice for us on how to respond to such a thing without falling out with our families?
Definitely. Well, we have been working on that, especially on the coronavirus crisis. For example, one of my colleagues in India, Ali Abbas Ahmadi, has just published a piece for First Draft, which is called "How to Talk to Family and Friends About That Misleading WhatsApp Message." So his main findings around that, the first one is don't shame your loved ones, or it could like really severely backlash. So it is really essential to get out of this "I'm right, you're wrong" scheme, which is sometimes tricky with the fact-checking itself and the way we label fact-checking, because sometimes it's only reinforcing the worldview of the people who are already believing in the other theory. So I think that's also something that we need to think about collectively. The other thing is to show empathy, of course, and also be responsible and don't ignore the message or pretend it never happened, but actually think about the fact that it can have some real life consequences and have a real conversation about it. And also maybe don't expect immediate change. So this is an ongoing process, an ongoing conversation. And to have maybe a bit more tools to do that, we also created another course online, which is accessible to the wider audience, and which is called "Too Much Information: How to Navigate the Infodemic." And you can find lots of information there, like what's the infodemic, what's the misinformation about, how does it spread, what are the main themes, the question of the need for emotional skepticism. As I was saying before, this idea that everybody should be checking their own emotions before sharing information, because that's something we can all do if we start to take the habit to do so. Also, how to verify images on your phone or on your computer, because it's very easy to do so. So it's also something that we can do, all of us, very, very easily. And finally, a couple of guidelines to take care of yourself and sources, reliable sources to go to for reliable information. So this is all on covid.firstdraftnews.com.
Brilliant. Thanks for the plug, and I'm sure we can also share the link so that people can have a look for themselves. It sounds like everybody plays a role in responsibility for fighting against disinformation. So everything from the European institutions to national governments to journalists and media consumers themselves, we all have something to bear in mind that can help to create a better information environment. Now, at this point, we have about 10 minutes left, so I would like to open up the floor to the audience for questions. We already have a handful of written questions, but if anyone else would like to step in, then please feel free to raise your hand virtually, and I can come to you to let you speak using the microphone. Now, is the Vice President still with us?
Yes, I am here.
Yeah,
sure.
Great.
Hi.
So we have a couple of questions to begin with, which are directed to the Vice President, but I think that they might also be relevant for Jamie and Marie as well. So a couple of questions about the existing measures, particularly the Code of Practice. Now I have two written questions from anonymous attendees regarding First of all, co-regulation. Do you agree that co-regulation should be the next step, as suggested by the AV, the audiovisual regulators? They had a report recently that suggested that the next step would be for the code of practice to no longer be merely voluntary, but to be a step towards forming regulation jointly between the social media platforms and other signatories of the code of practice and the European institutions. So will the Commission present obligations for transparency, key performance indicators and sanctions is one of the questions. And the other question is relating to the recent joint position paper by several EU member states that said that the code of practice was insufficient and unsuitable and calling for some kind of reform. The question is, do you agree? I would add also, is the code of practice going to be reformed? Is this going to be part of the democracy action plan? Or what are the main next steps there? And I will take the other two written questions as well, just so that we cover everything at once and save a bit of time. There's two questions about foreign actors or disinformation outside of Europe. So a question from Dmytro Shkurko from the National News Agency of Ukraine. Disinformation, of course, isn't just a danger because of its influence on a European audience, but also actors in other countries, including in Russia and China, creating a kind of virtual reality for their own populations. Does the Commission have a strategy in this regard? And what capability does the EU have to achieve goals in that direction? And I have one more question from Lu Yan Ren, which is the EU named China as a foreign actor that spreads disinformation, but again didn't mention that China is also a victim of disinformation or conspiracy theories, supposedly sometimes spread by the European media. Should the EU and China work together to counter disinformation rather than pointing the finger at each other? So Vice President, I will give you the floor first, and I will bring Jamie in afterwards because I think some of those questions are also relevant for him.
Thank you very much. I will be brief because we don't have much time. But first, let me react on what Jamie Fly said, that what Europe should learn from United States. We will be happy to bolster and support independent media. And at the day we have the digital tax available, we will do it in an intensive way, because this is also what differs the EU from United States. Because this is also about the funding. But from a European budget, we said very clearly that now the support which goes to the member states should go to media sector, because these are employers and they are doing extremely important job now. And also for the recovery plan, there is an amount of money which should go to the media sector. But I'm always ready to learn from US useful things. The questions, existing measures, up to now we worked in a voluntary using the voluntary method, and we said very clearly that we should come with the mixture of regulation and non-regulatory actions, which will kind of replace the code of conduct and code of practice. So this is what you will see in the Digital Services Act and in the European Democracy Action Plan. So indeed, there will be regulation plus non-regulatory actions. And it's not so much that the codes do not work, but we need legal certainty, and we need to cover the whole market, because we do not have all the platforms on board. And we need to stop fragmentation of the EU rules. We have German law, French law. We should come to one solution. Position paper on from the letter from the member states. I welcomed it. This is very encouraging. We received the letter which said do more against disinformation. So this is what we are doing, and what we will do also in cooperation with the member states, because especially from security point of view, the member states are in the front line, especially the Baltic Sea states. So we will work on it, and the letter is something I welcome. On the foreign actors, well, our strategy, also, which is shown in the paper we adopted on Wednesday, is more resilience and more assertivity in communication. We do not want to start some propaganda on Russian or Chinese territory. We just want to be well equipped with the facts and figures and the trustworthy information for our citizens, and we do not want to leave the space to be occupied by the foreign actors who want to do harm to European Union and European citizens. So this is our strategy, and of course, speaking about foreign actors, speaking about Russia, China, others, there is a space for diplomacy. This is not the end of the days. Yes, we named and shamed China and Russia now, but we are going to have a dialogue with both, and this is our long-term plan to decrease the level of propaganda and of fake news also by means of diplomacy. But Russia has the disinformation as part of the military doctrine. And Russia speaks about the EU as a temporary structure or a temporary arrangement. So you see the space is not big, but we are always ready for a dialogue. Last sentence on China. There was silence at the beginning about the corona spread, and I would like to say that even silence can be a danger. Fake news. And I remember well Chernobyl disaster. There was silence, and it was very dangerous for the people. And we didn't hear anything from Soviet Union. And so we should pay attention to the need to inform the people and to be open and transparent, not only from the side of the platforms, because we keep speaking about them, but from the point of the responsible authorities. Yeah, so I think that we have several important lessons learned, and I say I will be short. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice President. Jamie, we do have a couple of minutes if you would like to also come in, particularly regarding the efforts that the EU can take to support those who are facing disinformation in other countries outside of the EU, and on the point about the EU and China working together.
Sure. Yeah. One brief note first on the code of conduct, which obviously I'm not going to insert myself into, but I think a key part of the solution here is getting the tech companies, the platforms, to look at algorithm transparency. They've made great strides in taking down malign accounts and malicious actors, but they haven't been open with their audience about how their algorithms actually are making decisions about what an individual user sees. And that's a big part of the problem. And it gets to the earlier discussion about whether there's more awareness. And I fear that many of us are living in bubbles online, and within the audience that would attend an event like this, I think there is more awareness. But there are many audiences online on social media platforms that are still in complete denial about whether disinformation exists about very important topics. And a lot of that is just because of the diet of information that they're being fed on a daily basis by those algorithms. So that's just one thing I'd note. Secondly, on the virtual reality that governments propagate, that's a big part of our work here. That's why RFERL exists in our markets, because we are independent and objective, and we're in many markets where there aren't a lot of other media options other than state-run media, whether it's TV or radio. And so, we're committed to providing alternatives to those audiences. I'm glad to hear that the EU is hopefully looking at how to prop up independent media in some of those markets as well, because it's not about going into those markets and pushing propaganda. It's really sponsoring ideally local journalists who can do serious reporting, who can hold their governments accountable. The one other thing I'd note, it's beyond just the information control that authoritarians use. They've also learned from the Russian approach to weaponize these tactics against their opponents. And so we see this against our journalists in almost every market we operate in places like Central Asia. Our journalists are personally trolled, attacked, harassed online by organized government troll farms that are modeled on the Russian approach that we've seen from the Internet Research Agency and others. And this is a real challenge, this proliferation of the tactic, not just to control their citizens, but also then to really frighten, scare, run out of the market those who are trying to bring objective news and information to their publics. And governments in many of these countries are doing everything possible to limit the choices that their citizens have when it comes to information.
Perfect. Thanks very much. We have gone a little bit over time, and it is a Friday afternoon, so I'd better wrap up very quickly. But I would like to give the floor to Marie just very, very quickly to say, just ask if she has any points in response to what we've just said. And maybe also, since we've talked about foreign actors a lot tonight, in your experience, Marie, is it the case that if someone knows that they are seeing something which has been spread by a Russian or a Chinese source, does that make a difference? Are they more likely, less likely to believe it, or are they less likely to share it? Just to wrap up.
So we did not see any studies about that. There is nothing which can really prove that. But what we see empirically is that people have a tendency to share whatever is close to their own worldviews. As Jamie was saying, all of the social networks are functioning in silos. So it's especially on messaging apps where you usually get your messages from your friends or family, you have a tendency to share it. And even if you know that it has been done by another country or something like that, I don't think that would make such a big difference. But I think what can help is to check our own biases, and that would be the case for people, but also for journalists in general. And I think it's also the case, for example, for Western journalists. I'm not talking here about governments because I don't know about that, but I'm sure that Western journalists also have a way sometimes to have a certain bias when they are covering other parts of the world. So I think it's important as we are trying, for example, to be a global organization, and to think about that quite a lot, and to check our own biases as well.
Perfect. Well, on that note, I think the time has come for me to say thank you once again to all of our panelists. Thank you to the US mission also for their support for this event. And thank you to everyone who joined for the discussion. I wish everyone a good weekend. If you live somewhere where the lockdowns are beginning to ease, then enjoy it responsibly. And wherever you are, be careful to make sure that you don't believe everything that you read online, and also think a little bit about your own biases too. I think that's an important note to end on. So thank you once again to everybody, and
thank you.
Wishing you a good weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.